In case you missed it, Chad's been reminding us that today's Father's Day. Tim. I always think about, days like this, as a very proud father of four, with four in-law kids that we consider to be ours as well, and then the grandkids, but I also think about, the way somebody put it, just kind of being a little sarcastic, said, "And lo, the card company said, we made a great profit on Mother's Day. Let's develop Father's Day and Grandparents' Day and Groundhog Day." And oh no. We have these days, and it's really interesting when you think about it, because as I mentioned a little bit on Mother's Day, not everybody has a good impression of mother or father. People, I read an article on the internet before Mother's Day where a young woman was saying that she dreads going to church on Mother's Day because she had a really bad mother. And I think sometimes that may be true on Father's Day, that people have had fathers who were abusive in all of the different ways that we might understand that word. Or fathers who were absent. Fathers who were distant, unapproachable. Fathers who were so strict that, that there was just no relationship there. No love, no trust. I think that while we recognize that we can't just, paint an idealistic picture of fatherhood in the world in, 2014, that the fact that it is Father's Day does bring us to think about some things. And I want to think in terms of parents generally, although father is going to kind of be a little bit of our theme as we're talking this morning. As we think about the life of Jesus, and I find it interesting that we have 4 books, the first 4 books of the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, that are all given to telling us the story of the life of Jesus. Only 2 of them, Matthew and Luke, tell us about the events around Jesus' birth, the events before and his birth and the events immediately after. All 4 of them tell us about his ministry, which we estimate was about 3.5 years. The biblical scholars argue about how long it actually was, but the indications seem to point to about that period of time. But what about his childhood and youth? This is the only story, really, after the birth accounts until we are introduced to Jesus as he begins his ministry. What about Joseph and Mary? We do read about Mary more in the Gospels, but again, Joseph is only mentioned after the birth accounts in this account in Luke chapter 2. And it seems that at some point between the events that we read about in Luke 2 and Jesus beginning his ministry, Joseph is gone. The assumption is that Joseph is dead. And so maybe if it helps some people to think about that, it's quite possible that Jesus, at least as a teenager or when he's in his 20s, loses his father in terms of we might call it his adopted father. And so he knew what it was to live in a single-parent family with his brothers and sisters. Luke 3:23 is where we, by the way, find out that Jesus was about 30 when he began his public ministry. So, here in Luke chapter 2, 41 to 52, we have this account of the visit to the temple. It tells us that Jesus is about 12 years old, and it's time for the feast of the Passover, and that Mary and Joseph have the regular custom of going. The Passover was one of three of what are called the pilgrimage feasts, where it was intended in the law that all of the people of Israel would come together for these feasts. And Passover seems to have been very high on everybody's agenda. They seem to really identify that with that, and they wanted to go. And Joseph and Mary made a habit, made a routine. That's not a bad thing. That they went. That was their custom to go. And so, as this account tells us, they went when he was 12, as was their regular custom. And they go through the Passover, and they're on their way home, and Jesus was missing. It says they traveled a day, and we look at that and we think, how do you travel a day and not notice your kids with you? But you realize that they're traveling in a group, probably a very large group. That there are other relatives, other members of the family, other members possibly of their community. And, let's face it, moms and dad, you come to church, you ever see your kids during the time you're in the building? Or are they off with their friends? They're somewhere. That's pretty well norm, isn't it? It's not a surprising thing. But it's when they realize, a day later that they don't have him, that they go back to begin to look, to see where he is. And they find him in the temple. And that's a very powerful scene to me. You can hear, Mom, why did you do this to us? And, I hear the voice of myself when I was that age. I hear the voice of my kids when they were that age. I hear the voice of your kids when they're that age, kind of saying, well, why were you worried? Kind of like, I knew where I was. Don't you realize that, and the King James Version says, don't you realize I must be about my Father's business? NIV has that interesting wording, says that in my Father's house. He's engaged with the religious leaders, with the teachers, asking and answering questions, causing them to marvel at this 12-year-old. I think that's a kind of a neat thing, because I've met, I always see some of the kids here in the congregation who at 12 have an amazing understanding and comprehension of their faith and of what God is about. And so the story kind of ends, and we're left kind of wondering, and I talk about this, like the what happens next kind of a thing. Well, can you imagine what the conversation might have been like on the road now back home? Mom and Dad, it's like going home in the car from church. You ask your children, I hope you do, what did you learn in Sunday school today? What did you talk about? And you think about what Jesus could have shared with them and told them about. And, Mary wonders, not in a negative sense, but she marvels at these things and just stores them up in her heart. And so then we have verse 52, which is a summary that covers about 18 years. Isn't that interesting? One verse summarizes what happens from verse 51 at the end of the story to what happens when he begins his ministry. Jesus increased in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and man. I don't know if you've ever noticed it, but that is not the only verse where Luke tells us something like that. You back up to verse 40, and Luke says, the child, Jesus, grew and became strong, and he was filled with wisdom, and the grace of God was upon him. Sounds like a theme, isn't it? Jesus developing, growing. Well, what's interesting here is that Jesus increased. I don't know if you've ever thought about that word. The idea of the word, the Greek word that's translated here, is to grow, progress, advance. In other words, it's reminding us that when Jesus was born, he was made like us in every way. What does that mean? Jesus did not pop out of the womb as a baby and start walking and talking. Jesus developed in all of the ways that we did. When Jesus learned to walk, he fell down, just like our kids, and like we did when we learned. Jesus developed in normal physical ways. Jesus went through those processes of growth. You know, there's an interesting discussion that's going on in the evangelical world, and some of it is caused by some of the language, some of the terminology, maybe a better word to use, some of the terminology that's used, but it's kind of talking about this idea and kind of emphasizing the idea that Jesus was not perfect as a child. They're not talking about behavior, they're not talking about moral. What they're talking about is that Jesus would have toddled along. You know, those beginning steps, he would have fallen, he would have gone through all of the stages that normal children do. And so to think about the idea of Jesus going from an infant to a 12-year-old to an adult, I think causes some things for us to think about. That as you think about the growth and development that happens through that time, it becomes very important to think about what was Jesus' family about? What about these people, Joseph and Mary? We often, I like to think about being a parent as a stewardship from God. That God gives us the life or lives of these babies for us to care for and to look after and to feed and nurture and help to develop. God entrusted Jesus, his son, to Mary and Joseph. And I can't help but get this mental image, you know, because anybody that knows anything about, you know, adoption in our world, in our culture, knows that if a couple goes to an adoption agency and says, we want to adopt a child, the child doesn't, the office says, oh, good, here's a baby. There's a lot, you know, they call them studies. There are a lot of home studies that are done. They look at that family. They look at those people. They find out what kind of people they are. What are their finances? What are they like personally? What are their jobs? What are their habits? So imagine, you know, what God would look for in a human couple as a place to adopt out his son. And you kind of think about, wow, that says a great deal, doesn't it? Well, when we think about Mary, we think about somebody who, when Gabriel approaches her and tells her, you know, that God has chosen to bring his son into the world through her, who has the faith and the courage to say, may it be done to me according to your will. And we find Joseph as a man of character, a man of humility, a man who believes in what is right, but is not a man, you know, when Mary becomes pregnant, his first reaction is to, it says, put her away, divorce her, because he knows it's not his. Yet he doesn't want, you know, he's not one of those angry, vengeful types who wants her life and her blood. And then when Gabriel appears to him and tells him what's going on, like Mary, he's ready to step up and step into that role. And you think about it, for Joseph, it really is very much of a second place. Because Mary will always have the idea that she has been mother of this child, and Joseph doesn't even have that. So when God put Jesus into their lives, it was to put him into a place to grow, to develop, to mature, to become the adult who would begin that ministry at the age of 30. And so as you think about that, I think that's a really intriguing thing, because it helps us understand the idea of what growth in family is about. Okay, we've been talking about the Shema the last couple of weeks. 2 weeks ago we talked about the Shema. There were kind of some other ideas related to it. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one. And you think about how, as part of that, the idea of talking about God with your children, that role, that spiritual role. Okay, well, see, it says here in Luke 2:52 that Jesus increased in wisdom. And I love the 4 points that it makes here about Jesus' growth and development. He increased in wisdom. He increased in the mind. Wisdom is not just knowing the facts, but it's knowing how to make the good choices. It's knowing what's healthy, knowing what's right, knowing what's good, and the understanding that goes with that. As Jesus is developing as a child in those ways, you understand that Mary and Joseph are the guardians that are helping shape that. Stature is the way that it's translated. It's the physical development of the young person. We realize, one of the things that our culture is talking a lot about is the fact that many children are not getting the physical development they need. And I'm not going to editorialize on that, but just kind of realize that's an important part of the development of a child and their growth. But it's the other two, that he increased in favor with God, the spiritual. Just the very simple fact that Luke mentions that Mary and Joseph regularly made the journey from Nazareth down to Jerusalem for the Passover. That their faith was not just a nominal type of a thing, that their faith was real, and it motivated them to go out of their normal comfort zone to do what they knew that God wanted his people to do. That's an important place for God. And also favor with men, the social development. You look at the home, and you look at these ideas together. That's an important, powerful idea. That as parents, we have responsibility to look after the intellectual, emotional, spiritual, physical growth, and social growth of our children. That we want them to be whole. That's really what that is talking about, is the wholeness that Jesus had because of the family that he was part of. As you think about the home as a place to grow, I'm going to suggest a few things that I think we need to keep in mind. The number one, home needs to be a place of safety and security. We live in a culture that we are constantly being bombarded by the news of homes and families that are not safe, where children are growing up in places that are not secure. They're not healthy. That the Christian home needs to be a place where there is no possibility of abuse, where we are concerned for the safety, the welfare, the emotional development of our children. And you think about it, that isn't to say we lock them in a bedroom until they turn 18. Because of the other things that need to be part of that development. But it is that, especially within the home, that as parents, we teach our children and demonstrate for them what love is really all about. It's unfortunate that much of the world has the idea that people who believe in the Bible think that discipline, for example, is abuse. Now we here in Manitoba hear stories of religious people who are being taken to court for abusing their children in the name of biblical discipline. No, our homes have got to be safe. Source of security. We have to demonstrate priorities to our children. That's where they learn them. We laugh about the expression, do as I say, not as I do. Jesus warned about the Pharisees in Matthew 23. He said, listen to them when they're sitting on the seat of Moses, but don't follow their example. Well, for parents, I remember, and I'm trying to think of his name, and it's just slipping right now, but I remember an author talking about the effective father. And he referred to the father as two ways. Number one, as a pace car. If you go to a car race, it isn't like a foot race where everybody stands behind the line and they say, on your mark, get set, go, and they shoot the firing pistol. What they have is they have a lead car, a pace car, that leads all of the cars around the track for a few laps and to get everybody ready to go. And then he speeds up, and then he pulls off, and they get the checkered flag, and they're off. Well, everybody's watching that pace car. That's what dad needs to be. That's what parents need to be for their kids, to set the example. The other one that I really loved that he used was the expression, wear shoes that you want filled. But he just used that figure. Paul uses that idea, like obedient in Ephesians, like obedient children. Follow your father's example, talking about God. But you think about it. We as fathers, as parents, need to set an example for our children. And I've used the story before, but I always think about it. It's just so telling as a reminder. When I was little, toddler aged, my mom and dad both smoked. And so they had ashtrays on the coffee table. And one day they came in to the living room, and I'm standing at the coffee table, and I have one of the ashtrays in my hand. Only, guess what? I'm playing Lord's Supper. And so there's this little guy standing with the ashtray, bowing his head over it. Well, a couple years later, I was left alone in the car, and I pushed the cigarette lighter in, and I put it up to my lips. And I burned my lips. We had another family at church that had two little boys that were a little bit younger than me. They left them alone in the car. They pushed the cigarette lighter. They started fire to the car. Killed both of them. The power of example. We've got to honor the role of parents. If you think about it, if we say, parenting is nothing, and we just do anything we want to do, and then we see our kids doing something that suggests that they're emulating, they're following that example, that should wake us up. We should honor the role that God has put us into with these young lives, that the stewardship He's entrusted to us, and realize how important that really is. And so we set an example of the priorities of what comes first. Healthy relationships. Spending time with our kids. That's just so incredibly important. Every now and again I hear from an adult who tells me that that mom or dad or both never went to any of their activities? Had no idea what was going on in their lives? Of parents who were unapproachable? Yeah, I realize that when you got a dad like me and I'm, 6'1", big, with a loud, booming voice, it's very hard to find something like that approachable. But you have to try to find ways to do that. Our kids have got to know, first and foremost, that we love them. Good communication. And I'm not talking about monosyllabic grunts. Like we're talking about, you're going home from church in the car. What'd you do today in Sunday school? Kids, you better pay attention today. You're going to get that question. I realize that often, say, when they get home from school, say, well, what'd you do today? Nothing. What'd you learn? Nothing. Sometimes it's got to be a little bit more than just simple reporting type questions, but things that show that we are concerned and interested in what their activities are, what their lives are like. Do we really know what's going on with their kids? Some people may be thinking, oh, I don't want to know what's going on. But maybe that's why. And as I've already mentioned examples. The idea that God chose this young couple, we assume they were fairly young, this young couple to entrust baby Jesus, as we like to think about it, December, baby Jesus, to put that young infant into the hands of human beings. You think about how he would choose the kind of people that he would give that trust, that stewardship to. And yet, you think about, for many of us, that's what God has done. But I want to extend that, because I always think we need to remember this, that the church itself is a family. And that we are all part, as a community, that expression, that it takes a village to raise a child, that we are all sharing and part of that and the lives of the children that are here. And that's why it's not just the examples of mom and dad, it's the examples of other parents and their attitudes and their actions. Sometimes when a Christian is kind of not living very well as a Christian, that the kids notice. And it's often like to mom and dad, why is so-and-so doing that? It's kind of hard to explain, isn't it? And some of you mom and dads know what I'm talking about. We think about Father's Day, day to give cards, gifts, go out for lunch. Think of parenting. Think of the great challenge, the great gift that God has given to us in these young lives. Chad's chosen a song for us to close with, and as we're singing this song, we want to encourage everyone here to think about, most especially, your relationship with God, who is our spiritual and heavenly and eternal Father. And think about the relationship. He is the Father. Maybe you had an imperfect father. Maybe you had an abusive father. Maybe you had an absent father. He's the Father that, if you could choose, He's the Father you would choose. And hopefully you'll be thinking, if you're not a Christian, about the possibility of that kind of eternal relationship with God who loves and cares about you. And if we can help you in your response to Him, we encourage you. You can talk with me, you can talk with Chad or one of the elders after. Let's stand as we sing. Amen.